Sorry again for missing you last week. I don't want to make a habit out of that, obviously, but yeah, when you don't do this full time, sometimes other stuff in life gets in the way, and that is what it is. But we are back. I will not be doing another episode next week. We're just going to keep doing it every other week basis, and in the unfortunate event that, I miss an episode here and there, you're just going to have to go that much longer without the show. I know. Devastating. Me too. I don't even mean that sarcastically. I hated missing last week, but here we are. Anyway, before we dive in, as always, if you like this show, please subscribe to it from wherever you're listening. Leave a 5-star review. That is super helpful, but what is the most helpful is that this stuff gets shared. That's all I got. Springtime is coming, man. My allergies are killing me. Wherever you are, I hope your spring is more pleasant than in Arizona, where everything is always blooming all the time. All right, let's get into today's episode regarding parts of speech that are not protected.
Your right to swing your fists ends where another's nose begins. The harm principle.
It has been argued for centuries that a people who are not free to speak are a people enslaved. The actual thoughts of others are impossible to truly control, but speech is a much different story. It is actually rather vulnerable. The right to your own thoughts may be the very foundation of expression, but thoughts not conveyed by speech in one or many of its several forms might as well be thoughts never formed at all. From the lens of natural law, it becomes very self-evident then that man has a right to speak freely, for his speech to remain unabridged. But can natural law also find equally self-evident exceptions? Welcome back to your Bill of Rights podcast. Today, we will be continuing our exploration of our First Amendment's free speech clause by examining the very narrow field of unprotected speech, the type of speech not guaranteed to us by natural law and, therefore, not recognized in our First Amendment. If this is your first time with us, then I encourage you to, at the very least, go back and start with episodes 1, 2, and 4, as the definitions and theories we focused on there will help make today's episode make a lot more sense. As for the rest of us, let us begin exploring today's topic of unprotected speech. When it comes to unprotected speech here in America, it is much more important to focus on the how and why factors in specific speech being unprotected instead of the what. The reason for this being that exactly what falls into the parameters of unprotected speech is going to always vary greatly depending on an array of factors that can sometimes look very similar to speech that is in fact protected. For example, do we have a free speech right to threaten someone's life when we are angry? The answer is no, we do not. That is not protected speech. However, does a young man have the right to express his hatred for a military draft by proclaiming that if he is drafted, the first person he is going to use his new military training on is the president? Yes, he does. That is, in fact, protected speech. Kind of tricky, isn't it? With those examples alone, we can see now that to navigate these often tricky waters, it is vital to understand how and why certain speech can violate natural law before we can ever begin to determine what falls outside the parameters of protected speech. First, by understanding why certain speech can violate natural law, and then how, while keeping in mind a very important principle. Understanding why certain limited aspects of speech are unprotected requires us to revisit the natural law principles of equality and our 3 foundational rights, which we discussed back in episodes 1 and 2. Those being that all men are created equal and have the natural right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Natural law dictates that in our equality, no one can take these foundational rights from us, nor can we take them from anyone else. The logic here is simple. If we were free to take these things from one another, then inevitably some would have all while others had none. There would be no equality, and thus the violation of natural law would play out in brutal and chaotic ways. History has been very, very clear about this. The basic guideline here is a simple one. The theory of natural law sets limitations only when our actions, in the name of our liberties and rights, would infringe on the liberties and rights of others. So with that guideline in mind, how does speech begin to violate another's rights? Remember, speech is not merely the spoken word, but rather any expression of thought, including the written word and symbolic expressions or actions. The categories of unprotected speech have been philosophically, legally, and historically broken down into these categories: incitement and fighting words, true threats, obscenity, and defamation via slander or libel. Incitement and fighting words. Using Webster's 1828 dictionary, as always, to incite is to move the mind to action by persuasion or influence. In terms of unprotected speech, this is when one individual calls for direct action from others, some form of behavior which would directly and unjustly violate the natural rights of another. This means that we are not allowed to try and compel another person or group of people to, say, commit assault or murder against another individual or individuals. This would clearly violate their right to life. We are also not allowed to try and compel anyone to destroy or otherwise disrupt the security of someone else's property. You'll often see this take place during protests that devolve into riots. Property is often the result of our labor traded away in the pursuit of happiness, and therefore we do have a right to it and its security. We'll be learning a lot more about that, though, when we begin to explore our Fourth Amendment. When it comes to incitement, it is very important to understand that there is a critical distinction between when something is a direct call to action and when it is not, regardless of what negative outcome may or may not conclude from the speech. For example, if someone was to throw a brick into a window or at someone during a protest, or if they tried to encourage others to do so with their spoken words, even if no one else repeated the behavior, this is still incitement. They were still attempting to persuade others into unlawful action against specific targets. However, if violent behavior came as a result of, say, a heated political speech or article in which the speaker referred to their opponents using inflammatory rhetoric, something like calling them a danger to the Republic, this would not be incitement on the speaker's part. There were no direct calls to action. It was merely just a heated, overly dramatic political speech, which is protected by our First Amendment. The speaker cannot be held accountable for the actions of others if there was no direct action specified. Fighting words, while still technically upheld by legal precedent, are, frankly, a bit nonsensical. Traditionally, the idea behind fighting words is that they are words, or better yet, speech, that one could reasonably interpret or understand to pose a threat to someone. Can you see the problem with this, though? Interpretation is subjective and various, not self-evident. Take a burning cross at a Klan rally, for example. We all know the historical context of this symbol, and you could assume that a burning cross means that harm may come to someone soon. But what harm has actually been called for or carried out? A burning cross by itself, and even at a Klan rally, is not a direct and actual threat to anyone, even if the symbolic nature of it is threatening in its ideology. This is actually a perfect example of natural law being taken out of context or misused. In this practice, one interprets natural law based on their own personal feelings instead of what actually is. The danger in the concept of fighting words is that they are left open to interpretation at all. The last thing we ever want our government to have is the power to interpret our speech as dangerous, as they will undoubtedly warp anything they don't like or agree with into the realm of fighting words. Thankfully, our courts have been very good about throwing out cases regarding fighting words. There is no need to interpret unprotected speech based on feeling when a better form of adjudicating such matters exists in the form of true threats. A true threat is speech directed at a person which clearly expresses the intent to unjustly violate the rights of another. Let's use that burning cross again as an example. At a Klan rally on Klan property, this is protected symbolic speech. It absolutely conveys an unfavorable, hateful, and even violent message against non-whites generally. But since it is directed at no one specific, there is no true threat. That same cross, though, on, say, a black individual's front lawn is, however, a true threat. That same unfavorable and hateful messaging is now on someone's property and clearly directed at them and therefore is unprotected speech. If someone was to point a gun at you or brandish a knife, this is also a true threat. If someone was to simply just tell you that they were about to cause you harm to you or your property, this is also a true threat. It should be pretty obvious by now why these types of speech are not within the free principles of natural law. They seek to disrupt or otherwise prevent someone else's rights, thus creating inequality in rights. Obscenity is the next category of unprotected speech and arguably the most narrow. Obscenity is defined as offensive, and in its definition, we can see why this category is so narrow. The idea of what is objectively obscene is left open to too vast of an interpretation, which, as we learned just a few minutes before, is not a power we want granted to our government. Foul language, for example, may be obscene to many, but not all. Pornography, music, movies, or art with gratuitous amounts of violence or sexual rhetoric, sacrilegious symbols, sexual fetishes, all obscene to certain people, no doubt, but also enjoyed by others as forms of free expression. When it comes to obscenity, the only natural law position which would prevent one from being obscene is when these obscenities typically involve children, and most always in a sexual context. The natural law argument for this is simple. Children's minds are not developed enough yet to properly think through and come to their own conclusions about things of a sexual nature. They have not built up the emotional fortitude to endure the often heavy and complicated emotional weight that comes from sex in any of its forms. Nor are their bodies developed enough yet to endure the physicality that comes with sexual acts. Most children are also unable to remove themselves from these situations if ever presented due to their natural inclination to do as adults say. In more simplistic language, children are simply not developed enough in either mind or body to give actual consent when it comes to partaking in things of a sexual nature. To have them endure such things would undoubtedly cause a great deal of physical, mental, and emotional harm, and thus deprive them of their natural rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. This also applies to exposing children to obscene sexual acts as well, and for the same reasons. It's why you can't walk around in public while naked, for example, and other things of that nature. Defamation by means of slander or libel are the last two sections of speech not recognized in our free speech clause. To commit an act of slander is to knowingly speak a false tale or report with the malicious intent to injure the reputation of another by lessening him in the esteem of his fellow citizens, by exposing him to impeachment or punishment, or by impairing his means of living. In more modern language, this translates into the act of knowingly telling lies about a person with the intention to cause damage to their reputation in such a way that they suffer from criminal punishment, societal ostracization, or financial ruin. For example, let's say a woman was to be fired from her job, and in retaliation against her former boss, she began to tell people that said boss sexually harassed her while she was employed there. This would be a blatant act of slander. The fired woman was hoping to ruin the reputation of her former boss, which would undoubtedly put his job and finances in jeopardy, as well as his freedom if the law were to get involved. Libel is essentially the same as slander, only using some form of written speech, whether in the form of a newspaper, social media post, painting, music, etc. An easy example would be if our disgruntled former employee decided to take her accusations about her boss to her social media pages instead of just simply telling people. It's fairly easy to see how defamation is an enemy to our liberties. To damage someone's reputation purely out of malice can lead to the loss of their financial stability and even freedom. This is a disruption to their pursuit of happiness as well as their life and, therefore, also their liberty. This is especially true if someone was to find themselves imprisoned over false allegations, something that, unfortunately, happens all too often. The how and why behind the concept of when free speech reaches its limits is fairly simple, maybe even self-evident to some. If it presents a true infringement on the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness of another, it is not protected speech because none of us possess the ability to infringe on those things. But we have also seen today that determining what exactly falls into the realm of unprotected speech is very tricky. So much so that in our 240 plus years as a country, we still wrestle with this. In fact, we will probably always wrestle with this. This is because adjudicating between when speech is protected and unprotected often means trying to determine someone else's intentions, what they were truly feeling in their heart of hearts at the time they professed their speech. This is a near impossible task. Men are not God after all, meaning our judgment of such matters is, at best and only when it's not incredibly obvious, accidentally accurate. Let's revisit our friend protesting the draft by saying he would put the president in the scope of his rifle. This is an actual real-life example, by the way. This young man was determined to be well within the boundaries of protected speech. But how is his rhetoric any different than someone, during a heated argument, expressing their desire to kill the person they're arguing with? Both are highly emotive statements brought forth by a series of unfavorable circumstances towards the speaker, after all. On its face, libel or slander occurs if the speaker was speaking from a basis of false information, but can it still be considered defamation if they were speaking from a position of good faith, meaning they believed what they were saying was true? Or what if they were speaking falsely for the purposes of comedy? Think Alec Baldwin's long-running Saturday Night Live rendition of Donald Trump, or stories from the National Enquirer magazine. Can a painting of a specific person getting their head chopped off by a different specific person be considered a true threat? Does it imply honest intent or simply wishful thinking? How would you ever really know? These examples are why we must understand that leaving such a task to the authorities of government puts us in a very dangerous and unfavorable position. However, we must also acknowledge that society needs government in order to function properly, and that government must be granted limited authority by the consent of the governed to see that it can. It is a constant teeter-totter-like balancing act whose stakes are arguably never higher than when it comes to free speech. This is why it is so incredibly important to always ourselves apply and to always demand that the governmental authorities apply a key principle when it comes to free speech. And really, it's more of a rule. When determining whether or not speech is protected, we must always lean towards more speech, not less. It is vital to adjudicate speech not by trying to find ways in which it is unprotected, but rather by trying to find ways in which it is protected. This is a subtle but crucial difference when it comes to making sure we are always allowed to speak freely. We must, as a society, take every unfavorable opinion, every disgusting act of obscene expression, every swear word, fetish, violent video game, and awful belief, and, free from our own biases, aggressively wrestle it using logic and reason to fit into the realm of free speech. Think of it as squeezing as many people as we can into a phone booth. We must approach it with the desire to make it free speech, exhausting all efforts to do so. It is only after we have endeavored to points of intellectual fatigue can we determine that whatever speech still remains outside of that proverbial phone booth might fall outside of the realm of unprotected speech, and even then, only after seeking a second, third, and even fourth opinion. Thankfully, this principle is still very much applied in our hired courts and laws on the books, at least for the most part, but we will get back to that in a second. Remember, speech is the expression of our thoughts. To suppress speech is to suppress thought and make slaves out of men. For how can you even be free if the very thoughts inside your own mind are not yours? This is why it is important to always try and fit speech into the realm of free speech and not the other way around. To do the opposite, meaning to instead try and find ways in which speech would not be protected, would mean you're not only trying to limit rather than expand free speech, but also something much more dangerous and nefarious. To approach speech with the intention of finding violations rather than freedom means you're much more likely to attribute malice and bad intention where there is none. You are much more likely to find danger when no danger is present. In fact, this practice has unfortunately grown in popularity here in the US and throughout Western civilization as a whole over the last 2 decades. It is a tyrannical and nonsensical theory that completely violates natural law and the freedom of thought by means of dangerous emotive interpretation. It has sadly sprung up in local jurisdictions all over the country in some form or another. I'm talking about the theory of hate speech. If ever there was a true and present threat to the First Amendment, it is the theory of hate speech. It is a purely emotionally driven philosophy that actively works to attribute danger into a person's thoughts and expressions by means of applying intent without evidence in order to justify the removal of said speech. Now, in short, there is no such thing as hate speech, but the belief in it is such a threat to our liberties, and it is such a mainstream force these days that it deserved its own full episode of deconstruction. We will be examining and hopefully obliterating this pervasive and evil, and yes, I do mean to call it evil, force in full next time. Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Your Bill of Rights podcast by Jerkcat Entertainment. This show was written with the following titles as its sources: The Bill of Rights by James Madison, The Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, The American Constitution by the Founding Fathers, The Know Your Bill of Rights book by Sean Patrick, The Bill of Rights, Understanding the Constitution and Your Freedoms by David L. Hudson, The Bill of Rights Primer by Akil Amar and Les Adams, Behind the Bill of Rights by Bill Norton and Jeremy Nelson, In Our Defense, The Bill of Rights in Action by Ellen Alderman and Caroline Kennedy, Webster's 1828 Dictionary of the English Language, Nature, Goodness, and God, The History of Natural Law Theory by Carrie Niederman, An Essay Concerning Human Understanding by John Locke, The Essential Natural Law by Samuel Gregg, The Book of Deuteronomy from the Torah and New King James Bible, The Rational Bible, Deuteronomy by Dennis Prager, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, How to Run a Country by Marcus Cicero, and a various array of letters, correspondences, and essays by several of our founding fathers, including but not limited to Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, and John Adams. All music is from epidemicsound.com and is remixed at Beer and Bourbon Studios. A special thanks to Jessica Castle for the opening quote. Your Bill of Rights podcast is recorded, mixed, and mastered at Beer and Bourbon Studios and is a product of Jerkcat Entertainment. Copyright 2024.